Hello and good evening. Welcome to this month's HLF Online. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, we welcome you to our monthly editions of HLF Online. And this evening, we have a story which spans Asia and the UK, and Shalimar is the novel that we are going to talk about. Shalimar is the story of a family, and Shalimar is also an imaginary place. And Shalimar, the novel, combines realism as well as magical fabulation. And to tell us more about that, we have the author with us, Davina Quinlivan. And Davina currently teaches at the University of Exeter. She teaches English and creative writing. And although this is her first novel, she has written a lot on cinema, which she also used to teach earlier. And Davina, in this very fascinating novel, Shalimar, tells the story about migration, about place, and she tells the story about her own family, and she tells the story of, in a way, all of us. Because many of us have also lives which have moved away from where they used to be. So this is a novel which is very contemporary in its themes, and Davina is going to tell us more about her novel Shalimar, which, by the way, is going to be followed, I hope, very soon by another novel, which is a kind of a sequel to this, which will be titled Waterlines. Welcome to HLF Online, Davina. And to be on our behalf, Davina will be speaking to Surur Ali Khan. And Surur is, of course, one of us. She's a member of the HLF core group. And she has worked in the broad area of communications as editor, as website and social media manager at the United Nations in Geneva, where she lives now. And she, of course, is very active now in the digital space. She runs a regular blog titled Talking About Books, and she also reviews particularly travel books by women for the website Women on the Road. So, ladies, welcome once again to HLF Online, and we are looking forward to this evening's conversation about Shalimar, between Davina and Surur. And just to remind our viewers that I'll be back on the screen with your questions about 7:50 or so. That is about 50 minutes into the conversation. And so please go ahead and type your questions in the chat box, and I will, on your behalf, will take those questions to Davina and Surur. So with that introduction, it's all yours, Davina and Surur, and we are looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Vijay. Davina, welcome to HLF Online. Your book is it's a mixture of memoir, travel, and nature writing, and I came across this in my role as a book reviewer for Women on the Road. The book captivated me. Your ideas, your writing, the way you think about memory, because this is a book about memories, about how the stories of our families shape us and become a part of us, and how we in turn add our stories to them and pass them down to our children. It is a book about home and migration, about what home really means, and about grief and healing. And what I was fascinated by is your family history. I mean, you have such a rich history background. Your heritage includes Burmese, Shan, Indian, Irish, French, German, and Scottish. Could you talk a little bit about your family?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, Surur. And again, Vijay, thank you very much for inviting me to speak at the festival online. I always knew about those components. I always knew that those elements of my identity, of my heritage and my, I suppose, post-colonial identity sat with me all the way throughout my life, but I didn't know how to I didn't know how to articulate that. I didn't know what it meant, and I often felt quite alone in that too. So I grew up in Hayes in Hillingdon, which is in outer sort of West London, as it were. And fortunately, it was a very Asian community. It's very close to Southall, which is a huge hub for the Asian diaspora. So you could all the foods and all the kind of cultural experiences were on our doorstep. And I suppose that's why my family settled in that part of London. But having said that, I still felt quite alone in that I never really met any other Burmese children. And then I came along quite late in life. So my parents were already quite old. They were in their 40s when they had me. And I didn't have any other young people in my extended family that I could relate to. So I just carried that and I didn't know what to make of it. And I was just very curious. So in some ways that gives me a perfect sort of invisibility cloak for being able to just see through the eyes of an exile or someone who's on the outside all the time or is looking in and being objective and almost sort of being able to interpret what they see in different ways because they always feel isolated from that or separate from that. So yes, so sweeping complex heritage or shared heritage of European and Asian identity. So quite a lot going on there. My surname is Irish. My paternal grandfather, great grandfather, moved from Ireland, from Southern Ireland to the Bay of Bengal, and settled out in Asia. And my maternal great grandfather went out from Aberdeen in Scotland, and then also married a Burmese. So both of my great grandmothers are Burmese. My two great grandmothers, I know that for sure, and of indigenous sort of very ethnic minorities within Burma as well. So in a way, not even to say that they are Burmese, it's still quite a broad context because the Shan people and the Karen people are ethnic minorities, and they're on the sort of the west side of Burma, which has much more in common with the Bangladeshi side, and that sort of side of Asia. And we've seen things in the news about the Rohingyas as well. And I write in the book about how I share this heritage, and it strikes me. And I had time to think about that with the book.
Yeah, well, you're talking about the Shan people. I didn't actually know much about them until I read your book. And one of the things you said really struck me. You talk about the Shan women disappearing into the pages of a history book. What did you mean by that? Could you explain?
First of all, ostensibly, I don't have any pictures of those women, my great grandmothers, so I don't really know very much about them. I just know I've inherited stories about them, and I get a sense that they're present in the everyday, in the way that I experience life, or in some of I have an inherited piece of jewelry which belonged to my great grandmother, I think. But when I talk about this idea, almost like a children's picture book or this concertina of movement, where they're almost like Victorian cutouts, if you imagine kind of like a colonial figures, but they're actually Burmese women, and they disappear into the pages, and there's a sense of these untold stories and making that visible, not only for the reader but for myself, and knowing that they're not vanished, or that they aren't just vanished into those pages, but they're actually there in the present, in our everyday life, and in the way that I move forward and tell those stories. So I wanted to, there's something really something almost quite political about it, but it's also a sort of creative choice of wanting to bring those stories to life. So that's why I would describe it as creative nonfiction rather than a straightforward, more of a straightforward memoir. So I could have done a straightforward memoir where I traced my family history, got out of the family tree, and there's some wonderful examples of that kind of writing. But there was something else, and I suppose there was a voice inside of me that was also looking for some interpretation and exploration of memory, exploration of the way that we remember things or the way that we think about the world we inhabit. So it became about that. So I tried to tell the story through their eyes as well. So I quite early on, I described the idea of my grandmother, who is the daughter of the colonials and the Asian heritage going on there. She climbed the Blarney Stone in Ireland, and I remember her doing that. And of course, I was never there. I wasn't even born, I think. But I try to imagine, because there's something so kind of sensuous and rich and tangible about this really small kind of mixed Asian woman climbing this, this piece of this monolith in Ireland that had no meaning to her. She's inherited the surname. She's married someone who's of Irish origin. So I turn it around and I explore the idea of, is it a kiss or is it a metamorphosis? Or I also talk about Tipu's tiger and the idea of Tipu's tiger, the famous kind of automaton. It's almost like a kiss, although the tiger is, attacking the East India Company. It's kind of like an awkward kiss as well. So I explore this idea of the physicality and this idea of this climb. And that just took me straight into, the way that we inhabit our environment, the way that we inhabit time and place. And it kind of unfolded in that fashion, just trying to see through her eyes and imagine what it would have felt like. It was really useful for me to do that as well. It was just really useful for me to imagine, because I'd never thought of those things before. Yeah.
Well, that was actually one of the questions that I had, because in your book you have so many diverse elements. You have your past family history, recent family history, you have Old English legends, you have stories of yourself and bringing up your children, and the way you pull these all together. How did it all start? I mean, you've explained why you did it that way, which is my question, but also, how did you just start writing, jotting down memories, or did you actually set out to write a book?
So I had the initial first pages, which is just I'm a huge fan of Michael Ondaatje. I've probably said that lots of times, but I'll say it again. He's also very much a kind of film lover. He loves the rhythm and the movement of film, and he's also a fantastic poet. And I think there's something in the way that you can kind of express things through these kind of images, but also in the literary form. And so I had this image of my father climbing this tree, and I started that maybe, gosh, I don't know, in 2001 or something. And I wrote it first as a film, and I wanted to capture the idea because I was told this story from a very young age. He climbed this tree, and he decided to steal these mangoes from these sacred trees in a monastery where he was being educated in Rangoon, Yangon. And he'd already been a prisoner of war. He was born in 1937, so quite early on, the family were captured by the Japanese, and he was a prisoner of war at a really young age, younger than my youngest son now, who's like sort of 6, so sort of around 5 years old. So he ate the mangoes, and he didn't care about death. He didn't care about any sacred belief system or any ritual or anything, because he just witnessed so much. So something inside of him, even at the age of 12 or 11, he wanted to rebel and reject this, just because he wanted to eat as well. So of course, the next day, everyone thought he would die because there were red ribbons around these mangoes, and he didn't die. And he had lung cancer when he was in 2008, when he was in his 70s, and that kind of haunted me, and I kept going back to that image, even though he was alive when I wrote those film images, the script. It wasn't until 7 years later that he died. So the next day, the the mango orchard was decimated, and everyone realized that, you're not going to die if you eat those mangoes. So he was sent away. So he was expelled and sent away. And that was to Shalimar, or to Darjeeling, to be precise, to a boarding school, which still exists. It's called Mount Hermon School in Darjeeling, on the Libon Cart Road, I think. And they were the most happiest days of his life. So I started with that image, and I didn't really know where I was going with it. I was being a filmmaker. So I was imagining, it's like a close up of his hands reaching through the trees, and another close up of maybe he's listening to someone coming, and he's wondering whether he should turn away or turn back. And then I got so far, and I thought, well, I don't know what to do with this. I don't know, what do I do next? I know what happened next. He went to school, and then he came to the UK, but how do I really tell that, or how does it become my story? So I put that aside, and then I revisited it a long time later, and it seemed to me much more symbolic and powerful over the course of time. Gosh, I suppose 20 years later? 20, yeah, I'm 41 now. So 20 years later, so I wrote Shalimar. I wrote it sort of 2019. Actually, I started it before the lockdown,
right.
but I sort of stopped. So yeah, I had some sections, and then my brilliant publishers, Little Toller, who are based in Dorset in the UK, they're brilliant, because they just let you, they give you this space, and they allow you to just work it out for yourself. They're not hugely demanding. They don't tell you exactly what they want. They just say, we trust you. And I think that's the biggest gift you can give to a writer, to just say, for a debut writer, I think it's good to have some guidance, and they did give me lots of guidance, but they also trusted me. And so I needed to work out what the structure of that was. And then I realized that it was actually writing myself into the story, and making that connection between the boy who's climbing the mango trees, and incredibly my sons who climb our apple trees in Devon so many years later in Devon, and the gap in between. And it's not a long book, but I wanted to, very densely and kind of in a rich kind of tapestry, I wanted to kind of try and conjure that. So it's, broadly speaking, it's sort of 6 or 7 moves across deep England, because the other part of that story is when my dad passed away, we moved out of suburbia, out of West London, and for various reasons we were propelled to the English countryside. And I read something recently, I can't remember where I read it, but there's something about sort of like the post-colonial imagination, and the fact that the England you imagine is richer on the page than it can ever be in real life. So you almost feel a bit disappointed when, you read E.M. Forster, or you read all those kind of classic stories, and also the movies as well. So you have the Merchant Ivory movies, and then you actually experience it's quite different. And so I had in my head this idea of what that England looked like, and the rolling hills and the fields, and the Victorian buildings, and all that, this expanse of space. And often I was quite alone, so I'd be walking. So I started walking. I talk about that, and you said it's so you mentioned the way that it's sort of there's some questions about healing. Going back from that point, it's anchored within 2008, when my father was diagnosed with lung cancer, and we moved away, and I found it was a very difficult time. So I was 27, and I was writing my PhD, and I suddenly realized that I probably wouldn't have a dad by within months or within a few years, certainly not by the time I'm 30. So I've walked, and I would go off with our small dog, and I'd just continue walking, and I wouldn't see anyone on the roads, and it would be in these weird parts of Surrey or Berkshire or something, and I'd go and walk and cross lambs in fields, or cross all these gates and cattle, and I really hadn't seen anything like it. I'd never seen a sheep, a lamb, or any sheep being shorn of their wool, and lambing and things like that. That's very alien to me. So we spent the next 10 years moving through these landscapes, not in India or Burma, but in deep England. And so I try to build a world that connects both of those experiences and those imaginary experiences, and realizing that there's a way of doing that. So I move through this moment, and I keep revisiting it, where I try to explore the question of whether I should have left, or maybe I shouldn't have left, or what would have happened. And I see those lambs in the fields in Surrey, and it's probably another 10 years before I pick up a lamb in Devon and feed them hay in the barns near our home in Devon. And so you have this really strange, it's like I was looking at my own life through this kind of cinematic lens of cinema's really good with, it's a really good medium for time, because of the way that each kind of memory touches upon itself, and we can move through memories in a kind of fluid fashion. So my child knocks over a glass of water, and it reminds me of maybe my father drinking water and swimming in the pool in Shalimar. And I tried to connect very subtly, I tried to connect all those images into one narrative. So there's a loose structure of the 6 or 7 moves through deep England, which connects with nature writing. And then there's also there's some commentary on culture and identity, as well as what it felt like to be. I go back to my childhood, and I think about what it felt like at the time growing up, dealing with that. And then all the stories, realizing that my father really lived in that moment too. He was always a child in a way, and his childhood was cut short. So I moved through those moments, and then I decided to sort of 2/3 through the book, I decided to sink everything underwater. And there's a huge flood, there's a tidal wave and a flood, and all the places where we've ever been are flooded. And that I was looking for that moment where everything could come undone. And so that's where it breaks from the traditional structure of a memoir. And I wanted to add this magical realist element, because it seems so powerful to me to kind of rewrite all those places and kind of bring them all together. And I talk about The Tempest and Shakespeare and Prospero, and how they too were immigrants on their isle, and the relationship between the father and daughter, and how we're sort of left there awash on the shore. And I'm trying to say goodbye to him, and I say, pick up your things and you can go back to Shalimar. And I only wrote that once, and I think that I wasn't expecting it, and I sensed that there was this moment I wanted to write, but I didn't know where it was going until I started writing it. And then we go straight into Devon with a Burmese proverb: even the smallest amounts of water can wear away the hardest pebble or hardest rock.
Your father is very, very central to the story. I mean, I love that way it starts with him eating the mangoes. It captures you immediately, that image. And also what he went through during the Second World War. And as you said, he was always a child of that, but he carried that trauma with him. And it's in a way the way we carry ghosts of our previous selves within us as we grow. he was really, how did he influence you? What was, I mean, because you were obviously very, very close to, very, yeah.
Yeah, he was a great storyteller. So we went to quite a few Indian weddings in Hayes or in West London when I was growing up. And he would, by the end of the night, he would always have everyone kind of sitting around him, and he would be telling some story. And it'd probably be something he's repeated many times. And my mother would start to get quite, fed up with these stories. But he was really good at just very quietly just hushing everyone, and he would tell some story about something. He used to go to school riding a goat, or he would gamble, and there would be kind of his nickname at school was Poker. He was quite naughty, but also great cricket player and all those things. So we had quite a difficult relationship, because I think he suffered from depression from being a very young prisoner of war, and also how thinking through, I suppose the power of literature is to be able to inhabit someone else's mind and body, to be able to try and position yourself and empathize with that person. And it's quite a radical thing to empathize with someone you already know, but in a completely different way. And also because I had, he passed away over 10 years from the point when I write Shalimar. So I was imagining how he would have felt. He got muddled or confused sometimes. So he was sort of quite friendly with the Japanese soldiers, a bit like J.G. Ballard's Empire of the Sun. They used him to send messages, and he may have even imagined that they were his friends. And he had all that confusion that he carried around. So he could laugh, he could really laugh and enjoy himself, but also he had quite a lot of darker, quieter moments. So but yeah, I always felt like Darjeeling was on his shoulder. I felt like he'd never left, and that's quite weird to grow up with when you live in West London, and he's talking about the Himalayas, and he spoke many languages. He spoke a little bit of Tamil and Hindi and Punjabi and Burmese, of course. The Tamil, I'm not quite sure where he learned the Tamil from, but he would be able to speak to everyone, and he'd be able to find a way to communicate, and I really admired that. And yeah, so we were quite close, and I talk about his last moments and when he's ill, and he dreams of swimming in Shalimar, and growing older, because I'm still quite young when he passes away. I was 27, so it's very different from now, if it was happening now. So it allows me to deal with that, and to deal with the fact that there's a lot of things that I just didn't reach those milestones in life to be able to talk to him about about that stuff the way I would have now. For instance, I didn't have children back then as well, so I didn't share all of that. So I had time to articulate that, but in a way that kind of brought everything into the present. Like you said, the ghosts are carried into the present rather than being so distant from us and disconnected. I talk about him imagining him feeling the breath of the lambs on his hands out there in the fields, or maybe he sees a dolphin instead of a heron or a kingfisher on the River Exe. Maybe he's there seeing a dolphin, and I think that gives me great comfort. And also just to kind of reorganize or reconstitute the way I think about those people who are gone. They're not actually gone, and there is a way I can hold on to them. So it does that. I think it does that for me.
Yeah, it does. And I love the way you weave these memories together. It's like a palimpsest, the way you have your own story, your children's, and then your past, your parents and ancestors. And I love the way that you do that. Talking about Shalimar itself, the title, it refers to a very core idea of your book, which is home, right? I mean, Shalimar for your father was home. And it's also your aunt. I mean, you talk a lot about your aunt and her home, which becomes a sort of central point for the family at some point. You know, in the UK, you go there and she cooks for you and all this kind of stuff. And it's, yeah, I'd like you to talk a little about that. But also the other thing that I wanted to ask was, this is a question, I guess, a lot of us who have left the place that we were born and grew up in and moved somewhere else. It's the kind of question we ask ourselves. What is home? I mean, is it a physical place? Because after you've lived away from home for many years, I mean, I'm talking about myself. I grew up all over the place, but home is India. I mean, it still is Hyderabad. But I've lived out of Hyderabad now for, I don't know, 36 years or something. And Geneva's become home as well. And so what is home? Is it a physical place? Is it something you carry inside? So two things, it's Shalimar itself, and then that's question about home.
Yeah, thank you. I think, yeah, so interestingly, we were wrangling with the idea of the title for a long time. And it just became a series of conversations where we were trying to work out, also when you do a Google search or something like that, you've got to have some keywords or placeholder words, so that it comes up in the right way. And I wrote a very short piece on, I think it's litro.com, which is a really good literary online journal and blog. And it was called Shalimar. And that came out, I think, 2018 or something like that. And it still felt right to me. So I knew that I wanted to go attack that idea of the title and just think about it as a symbolic place, a floating geography, or a floating notion of home, or something. I don't want to sort of use these really big and quite annoying terms, but sort of like the way they might think about psychogeography or place as a psychological experience, or something which is about kind of something real, but also something that is a bridge between our imagination and a real place. So Shalimar was where my aunt went to live with her husband, my Uncle Hugh. At the age of 21, he was working for the Shalimar Paint Company as an engineer, and she went with him. And then when my father was expelled, they said, well, you can be his guardian. You can look after Lambert. So she was 21 and he was 11. So still, she was just so young. And it's still quite far from Mount Hermon. It's not particularly close, but she was nearer than Burma. So it became a sort of a floating geography, or a floating sense of home. And then there is something in the fact that we moved quite a few times before. We bought our first home in 2010, but then we've moved again since. And we kept moving, and then I moved away from the family home when my father was ill. So that was, rather than moving when I went to university, which I never did, I ended up moving in a quite hurried fashion, suddenly realizing that it would be good to maybe respect his time to recuperate, or just there was something necessary at the time to leave. So my family home was no more, in a way. And then we kept trying to create a home. We kept moving. And then I realized that actually, even with all those new moves, that my relationship to home was still shifting and changing. And it's very fragmentary anyway, because of all these migrations. And so we have the subheading, a story of place and migration, on a major and minor scale, because I track all those migrations as well as my own. And I'm still not quite, I think there's something in that in-betweenness, and in that cultural experience of being in between, and actually just coming to terms with that, and a reckoning with that, and also just thinking that that's okay. It's okay to feel out of place, that the out of place itself can be a place. And so I wanted to empower that position rather than undermine it. And I talk about the phrases which becomes a joke, where people say, "Where are you from? Where are you from?" And it just continues throughout the whole book. And people say, you know, I wear a dress which is just from a local, you know, high street store, and they say, "Is that Burmese national dress?" And I say, "No, it's not." And then we go to Suffolk and they say, "Where are you from?" And I also make a joke about that, and also just accept that as something that I like to play around with and pretend, and just you can just pretend to be anyone. You could just pretend to be you know, a princess from some other place. Or the whole idea of putting on other people's identities and putting on not necessarily a masquerade, but just that idea of sort of performing an identity, or just you know, the questions around authenticity. I don't know. I know as a child everything was embarrassing, and I just wanted to you know, be like my favorite pop stars or movie stars, or but not myself. So a lot of that, and being a woman as well, I think that just that's just taken time to want to be relatively happy being myself. And so the story is also about that. And in fact, it was originally called The Map Maker's Daughter.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So because the position of being the daughter is very important. And also the fact that I have these grandfathers who were colonials, and they had all the monopoly over the language and the imperial connections and the ownership of land and the ownership of the British Empire, and were, you know, ambassadors of that, citizens of that, yet they married indigenous women. And so I've inherited that tradition, but I'm also part of that indigenous tradition as well. And so the Map Maker's Daughter was sort of signaling all the stuff about land and maps and places. But I have since written a short piece about that, using that title. So I got to use it in the end.
Yeah. Also, well, you're talking about moving and heritage and things. So I just read a book called My Family and Other Enemies, in which you read, you know,
Yeah,
have you heard of it?
I know it, yes.
So the writer Mary Novakovic talks about the fact that immigrant families don't necessarily have family heirlooms that link them to the past, because they've often have to leave a lot behind from wherever they left. So what becomes really important is food, you know, family recipes, meals eaten together, that kind of thing. And that becomes in a sense, their heirlooms. This is what they pass down to their children, you know, that sort of thing. Do you feel that's true of your family? Was food a big thing?
Yeah, there's lots of references to food. And in fact, I had played around with the ideas of just writing down recipes to begin with. I suppose when my first child was very little, in the early years of having a small child, it's almost like your brain has to really focus on quite a few things. So my initial stages of writing this, or beginning to come to terms with what I wanted to do, began through the writing of recipes, and my aunt's recipes for things like a kind of an almond and rosewater bread pudding, which she made with almonds and saffron, and
wow,
and things like country capon, which is like it's chicken but with saffron and ginger and turmeric, and all those things, which actually I knew of them and I did eat them, although I was very suspicious of some of them. And even when my aunt was in her 80s, she would still cook for my parents, and she would sort of almost offer thanks because they would take her shopping once a week. So in return, she would make mutton curry or prawn curry or something like that, and she'd give this huge container full of curry, and it would last for a few days. So I start by talking through the idea of food and remembering through those sensations, I suppose, and again dealing with that idea of the unusual and the things that become abject, or things that you try to kind of jettison away because you don't like them, or you feel like they're not really part of you, but they have some resonance in your life. So I go through all those things, and then also how when my children were little, I started cooking for them, and most of those things don't exist in any kind of formal. There's no real sort of formal document for them anymore. They're just things that they made. I don't and they even pronounce them in ways that aren't accurate because they had such, their accents were very strange. They had very, very strong, very particular accents. So they said things in different ways. So yeah, the cultural memory of food is just such an important part of the book, but also I'm just so fascinated with how those stories and narratives can be expressed through that form too. And there's some brilliant writers who do that. There's at the moment, more recently, there's Michelle Zorna's biography called Crying in H Mart, and she talks about.
Yes, I've heard of that. Yeah, I've read it.
Yeah, she's actually the lead singer of a band called Japanese Breakfast. So she's talking about her loss of her mother, and then how she's sort of got this very strong bond or connection with Korean food, but also in the way that those foods hold memory, and how you pass those things on. And there's some amazing films about food and cooking, as well as things like you've got I wrote about it at the end of the book, the Lunchbox, brilliant movie.
Yeah, that was
it's such a lovely movie, and it looks at how food creates this bridge or this bond between people, with its tiffin carrier, and it's obviously I think one of them receives the wrong tiffin carrier, and it results in all these things happening. So there was a way into it from that, but only at this point in time, because at other points in time throughout my history, I just shunned anything. I shunned those discussions, and especially when you're a young person, you just want to be like everyone else. And my father always used to say, why do you want to be like everyone else? And so I just accepted that was part of what we did and who we were, but I didn't really celebrate it. It's not like I valued these things so highly when I was a child, but those things really do summon a kind of a sensory memory, like a kind of like a Proustian sensory memory, like the smell of turmeric and courgette, because she put these fritters, and you just have to put your head in the bowl. And I can remember, my mom making those street foods, or and it was a combination of sort of I suppose more Chinese style, Burmese style food, but also Indian food, because they lived in India longer, in fact. So I think they mainly, they would eat rice every day. My father never ate pasta. He was very suspicious of anything like pizza or pasta. Of course, as a teenager, that's all you want to do that. So
it's not real food.
No. So that was really important. And sitting around a table, and then as you reminded me, my aunt's house in Ealing, where they moved straight into this house in West Ealing from 1955 onwards, and they stayed. That house is, my cousin lives in that house now, but she just had that house, and she cooked in the kitchen and carried these massive saucepans with steaming rice and curry, and her hands always smelt of lemons, and there was a bit of there was lemon juice or onions or garlic where she'd been cooking, and I suppose that's home.
Yeah. When I was reading your book, you were writing so beautifully and so lyrically that I was wondering whether you you were a poet. I mean, how did you start writing? Do you write poetry?
I do write some poetry, but at the time, certainly at the time of writing Shalimar, I'd never formally published a piece of poetry. But I think, as I mentioned earlier, with screenwriting and the way that you might write for cinema, there is a kind of poetic balance in how you have to describe or summarize an object or a movement, and you can't give too much away because the camera can't do that. The camera can't tell you. So you have to say, a child's hand touches the glass of water and it tips, and the water moves along to one side of the glass. And you can describe a sound, or you can describe something you might, or the light on their hands as they're moving or touching something. And so I probably imagine things in that way. And I've become, over the years, I suppose, more attuned to all those details. And so things come more vividly to life to me through that way, and the language. In fact, Michael Ondaatje has co-written this brilliant book on film editing. So it's probably, it's a very weird combination of an author talking about editing, but I do see how that makes lots of sense. And how you have ellipses. There's ellipses, and when you choose to end a moment, and there's quite a lot of back and forth, as you said, in weaving those things together. So we move from my father as a child being carried through the hills in Burma, and I think his aunts, or the women who helped my great grandmother, would carry him in a sort of papoose, in a baby carrier, and he would talk about being carried through the village and smelling the tea, the Burmese tea leaves on his hands. And I moved from that to standing in the car park in Ealing Broadway, being told that he doesn't have very much more time to live. He's literally got a couple of months to live, and moving from the past and the present, and how I kind of connect those through pauses and breaks and ellipses. And the meaning is actually in the gaps. There's an amazing filmmaker called Atom Agoyan, who's a Canadian Armenian filmmaker. He's really interested in ideas around like the exotic, or shared heritage, and memory and cultural memory. And he says, the best version of his film is the one that is in the viewer's head. It's just that's the best version. Yeah. So it's actually about the gaps. So I didn't want to just stuff it full of details, but I wanted to make those gaps really sing out. I wanted those gaps to feel acutely present, like that gap between the end with Prospero and Miranda, and then the very last section of the book, which is the water in Devon. And it's what happens in that transition. It's also it's a transition in time, but it's also a transition in language, in spirit, in moving from the sense of saying goodbye to my dad and then entering the future in a way. So I think I'm going to play with that a lot more, and I think that's it. It means that I probably my writing's going to be a lot more sort of shorter, but I want to do a lot with those gaps, and with the detail, and with that denseness. So it is quite dense, but it's shorter in allowing that space for the reader, if that makes sense.
Yeah, which brings me to I think probably the final question. What's for the future? I know you're working on a couple of books. Do you want to talk about those?
Yeah, thank you. So it seems only right and appropriate to tell my mother's side of the story. So in a similar fashion, I wanted to continue exploring those ideas around our environments and nature and generational connections and memory, to tell my mother's story, but also the story that exists in the present with my caring for her, because she had dementia in the last few years. We were in Devon and she lived close by, and so we had all this time, and she's quite complex in other ways. One of the reasons why I didn't mention her as much in Shalimar was because there was a lot of things that I had to work through as well, that were too big and too sprawling to capture in that book. She was carried across the river Chindwin in Burma as a child during the war. She was born in 1940. So she's got this fear of water. So I wanted the title Waterlines refers to this crossing of this river, which has obviously had such an impact on her, and also the other rivers that we inhabited. So it's much more sort of water based, but it's symbolically so, in that I want to look at the idea of a trace or the waterline being a bit like in Devon we experience many floods, as you do of course in India and in certain parts of India. Certainly, the idea of the tide line or the water line, where you just have this very faint ghosting, this trace of something that's been there once but has now dried or disappeared. And I think that's a nice way of summarizing that sense of in-betweenness, but also the things that remain visible in terms of our identity and our heritage and place, and the things that are drawn away or absorbed by other things or the environment. So the idea of the water and border lines or border crossings are really important. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that. It will follow in the same vein as Shalimar, but be about a mother and
looking forward to that. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
And you're right, you're working on a novel as well, aren't you?
Yeah, I am. And just so I've completed the first draft. I'm waiting to hear from my lovely agent, Philippa. Hello, Philippa at DGA. This is something which almost kind of came out. I was writing it almost at the same time as I was writing Shalimar, because I felt like there was this other, much more strongly kind of fictional voice, which comes out as a result of exploring these ideas around hidden identities or hidden stories, and making visible the lives of marginalized people or individuals. So it takes place between the Black Sea and Cornwall. I started it before the war in Ukraine, but I have visited those parts, and I'm really interested in those histories. But it's sort of looking at a scientist, a marine biologist, comes back home to Cornwall, and she's of mixed origin, and she is coming back home to her mother's home in Cornwall, and her mother is Indian, and she's a poet, and her father's a Maori artist. And so instead of them, so she's a scientist, but her parents are artists. And it's about the idea of coming home. And there's a lot of kind of tropes and symbols in there, exploring mythology, and there's lots of sort of talking monuments and sculptures and tattoos, which are constellations of the sky. And there's lots of ideas around sort of mythology and identity. And it just gave me that sense of that space to enlarge what I was starting to do in Shalimar. So that's called Black Sea, and it's there. It's pretty much there.
Okay, looking forward to both of those. I see Vijay is back, so I guess we have questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is fascinating. And Davina, thank you so much for taking us, back in time, and also space, time, and also the literary landscape, which I found very interesting. You were bringing kind of a parallels between Prospero, Miranda, and your own relationship with your father, and the entire colonial context. This is really wonderful. I just wanted a couple of questions. You have touched upon that. One is, of course, the title, and what an evocative title that Mapmaker's Daughter is. I mean, I'm really fascinated by that. But when you finalized Shalimar as a title, did it ever occur to you that that there is a possibility of kind of exoticization, right? I mean, because these are titles that one usually associates with the kind of Orientalist.
Perfume.
Yeah. So
yeah.
did that come to you?
Yeah, I'm really interested in those ideas, and even with the cover as well. For instance, I think it stopped now, but every time a novel is set in Africa, there's an African sunset. And I think there's a huge question over representation and how you market a story such as this without falling into the trap of Orientalism.
Correct.
But the thing that I wanted to kind of explore and play with is that position of the exile, and how in so many multiple ways I've inherited this position of the exile, but also I've exiled myself in so many other ways as well, and so everything becomes alien and outside of my sense of self or my own identity. And so I wanted to play with that sense of the understanding of what that meant, or what does it mean, and then to turn it on its head by this being about England as well as those places, and not the colonial England that my father would have experienced in places like, Darjeeling in the 1950s, but rooted in this real sense of place and what we associate with the exotic. So with the cover as well, with the word and then the cover, it's a sort of play on Henri Rousseau's painting Surprise, which I talk about because I worked at the National Gallery for a while in the UK, and he'd never been to a tropical rainforest. So when he painted the tiger in the rainforest, he'd gone to the botanical gardens in Paris, but there are also the Shalimar botanical gardens, and I wanted to play on our ideas of something and the otherness of those ideas, as well as the authenticity of those, because actually Rousseau's paintings did much more than just create a fantasy of those places. It was actually expression of himself and of sense of wonder. And also at the end, I talk about my aunt's expression of that word Shalimar, because she said it in a very particular way. With the A sound is longer, so it's also about the sound. I talk about accents and voices a lot, so it was about the sounds of that word as well, and trying to reclaim, almost trying to appropriate the otherness or the exotic for myself, but also understanding that's part of the nature of of post-colonial literature.
Yeah, I asked that question, of course, because there are, I don't know if you are familiar that there was a film with that name, Shalimar, which was made by a non-resident Indian, which was all about the jewel thief and all that. So it was, so it was part of that. I also found it very interesting when you said, about the pressure, at least initially when you are growing up, to be like everybody else, and therefore kind of distancing yourself from your inheritance, your heritage, etc. And later on, of course, realizing that that's where, in a way, your identity lies. So, I mean, this sounds so so contemporary, so familiar. So I was thinking whether how do, for example, how do your children relate to that heritage now?
Yeah, so we so in a sense we talk about my family, and although they didn't get a chance to meet them, or they didn't get to meet my aunt or my dad, we talk about them, and we keep them alive in the present by having conversations about them. But also there's this huge sense of kinship, which comes to me as a shock towards the end of the book, where I realize that I'm not alone anymore. And that sounds a little bit cliched, but when you haven't seen any other Burmese children, and when you don't see anyone who possibly resembles you in the way that you do, and then you look into the face of your child, then there is something very striking and strange about that, because you suddenly aren't singular. And so some of that is just, we can all talk about that. We can all talk about what happens when we have children, but it's a sort of larger, it's a larger theme. It's a larger issue about what makes that kinship. You know, who are our family? Who are our friends? So, you know, and my eldest son has developed some of, well, especially when he was younger, when he was learning to speak, he would spend quite a lot of time with my mother. So he absorbed some of her accent. So he would say certain things with the sing-song in the tone of some of his expression. So it comes back to you. It comes back to you. And of course, they have a very loose sense of these places. They're only 10 and 6. And we're not just the sum of our parts. You know, none of us are the sum of our parts. But it's something to hold on to and to celebrate, rather than to feel othered.
Yeah. That's also, you know, I found your references to Ondaatje. So I was wondering, what other writers of, let's say, the post-colonial writers that you feel closer to, if not directly influenced by, you know, writers that you find similar to the concerns that you have, etc.
Yeah, so when I was younger, I was very familiar with the work of Hanif Qureshi, because I remember adaptations of his Buddha of Suburbia being on the BBC, and being absolutely startled by you know, this, which is still, you know, it's still very startling. It's held well, I think, over time. So him, Zadie Smith, of course, Arundhati Roy. His book I was given when I was at school. I picked that up with a voucher or something. I still have that, the 1997 edition. I love writers like what's the name? The Namesake, Jhumpa Lahiri. Yeah, just really beautiful, poetic, but also very searing and incisive, and so clever. I'm really influenced by a lot. I'm curious about a lot. So we studied, you know, Jane Austen and all those authors, Ernest Hemingway at school, but there's I like the poets as well, the poetry that emerges from that, and more contemporary writers. So this sort of area within a contemporary sort of 21st century context is also very interesting to me. I'm a huge fan of, you know, women's writing, or women writers of in that vein, but also anything that's very sort of non-generic or strange, or does something very unusual. I'm always drawn to, and that fits within, as Sura mentioned, those writers who are emerging and writing on nature and landscape, but from a post-colonial it's really interesting and diverse. So quite a lot of those, I would say.
Yeah, thank you very much. And, I also found your idea of the in-betweenness and what gets lost in the gaps is very interesting. And like, I suppose, similarly, what remains unsaid in a 50-minute conversation probably is also as interesting. And let's hope that we have an occasion to chat again. And for this evening, thank you very much for joining us at HLF and giving us a wonderful insight into your book. And we are looking forward to, like Surur said, we are looking forward to your future works. And probably after your father and then the next book about your mother, then probably we'll come to you in the form of a book. So
yeah,
we are looking forward to that. Thank you very much for this evening. And Surur, wonderful conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, you.
Ladies and gentlemen, with that, we end today's edition, and we will be back in May with another edition of HLF Online, and hope to see you all next month. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Davina.